Minion Masters developer BetaDwarf has just dropped a blog post, and in that blog post, there's some big changes to the game rules that'll be coming into the next patch 1.45. I'm Bad as Fish, and this is a blog post reaction. Okay, here we have the official blog post available on the BetaDwarf website. I will, of course, put the link in the description so you can check it out for yourself should you wish to. Now, if you've been following along with the BetaDwarf Minion Masters PTR, following along with the proposed changes, these changes will not come as a shock to you. But those that you who have not may be quite surprised. But let's have a look at what the changes are. So this is going to be coming in the next patch, which is going to be version 1.45. And there are going to be some core game rule changes. So what are those changes going to be? Well, these changes are going to be regarding bridges and how minions interact with the bridges. And the developers do put the point here that they think the change is going to be quite divisive, and they want to explain their reasoning why they're doing this to give people an overview before people get to actually try it. So the two main changes with regards to bridge interaction: firstly, minions cannot be played directly on the bridge. So formation is squished, similar to when there is a wall. So what this means is there's certain cards. So let's, for example, take a Scrap Pack or Swarmers as an example. These minions you can play directly on the bridge, and that's true of a lot of minions that give you multiple minions. So you can spawn them directly on the bridge, generally because one or two of them are a little bit further forward than others. And that means you can take the bridge directly with them, even if your minions are going to run backwards and defend. And secondly, minions with summoning sickness cannot be pushed onto bridges. So there's a couple of things to clarify here. What's summoning sickness? Well, most minions will spawn with summoning sickness. And what that means is, I think for the first second, they will not move or attack. And that's kind of, that's as a mechanic that's designed to make it harder to defend. You can't just place a minion down and expect it to interact immediately. There's a couple of minions that have the rush keyword, like the Screaming Scrap, for example, that doesn't suffer from summoning sickness, but most minions do. Okay, so then the second point of this, the pushed onto bridges, there is a collision mechanic within Minion Masters. And this is a mechanic that a lot of the top players will be aware about and will be using to their benefit, whereas a lot of the newer players will not potentially understand how this works or even be aware that it actually exists. So the idea of the bridge control with collision is that when a unit is walking over a bridge, if you place an appropriate unit on top of it, then that unit can be pushed away onto the bridge and you can cap the bridge like that. And we'll look at some examples in a minute. And one thing to understand with regards to collision is it's pretty much down to the size of the units that are involved, and more specifically, the weight of them. Now, weight is something that all minions within Minion Masters have, but it's not something that's obvious because weight is not a stat that's shown on any cards or anything like that. If you look at the data files behind the game, you will see that each of the minions has a weight, but that's not something that's obvious just from looking at the cards. So what happens is, if you have a heavy unit walking over the bridge, and again, we'll look at an example in a minute, if you have a heavy unit like a living statue walking over the bridge, and then you spawn on top of it a lighter unit, what will happen is that lighter unit will be pushed away from the big unit. The big unit will not be moved, the smaller, lighter unit will. And if you do that at the right time, it will push that unit back onto the bridge. So these are two changes that are going to be changed with regards to this. But what does this mean? Well, what it means is bridge control is going to get nerfed. A lot of the previous easy ways to take bridges are going to be removed. So control decks are going to feel a nerf from this, whereas aggro decks, concerningly potentially, are not going to, because aggro decks don't really rely too much on XP. They just want to do a lot of face damage and they're not too bothered about XP. And although aggro decks are not too bothered about XP, what happens is, if you're having to really defend strongly against an aggro deck, you can end up finding yourself behind on experience. Now, these two things that are being changed, these are mechanics that you can use to negate how much XP you're losing against aggro decks. But of course, with these changes being removed, that is no longer an option. I know this is a concern of mine and a concern of many others, is that aggro decks are pretty strong right now. And with changes like this, that's going to potentially increase the strength of those decks even more. But what it's important to know is that these changes are going to be for the 1.45 season. So we're all going to get a chance to try it. So this is going to be similar to how when wildcards were removed for a season or so a while ago. So we're going to get to try it. And then at the end of that, we'll be able to give our feedback through a survey. And then the developers, hopefully in conjunction with the discussion from the community, will then make a decision as to, are these changes to the core game rules that we like? Do we think that these changes have achieved what we wanted them to achieve? Do these changes make the game better overall? And I think one of the biggest discussions that's going to happen is that, as mentioned before, some of these mechanics, these bridge collision mechanics, for example, these are things that some new players won't even be aware of. So they'll play the game and they won't even notice anything's changed. Whereas higher level players, they will certainly feel this change and they will have to change the way that they build decks, how they play, and so forth. And now that's a concern, and that's also something that's very difficult for the developers because, of course, they've got to try to keep everyone in mind. And this is something that's always a problem with regards to balancing as well. You've got to think of new players, you know, mediumly experienced players and very high level players as well, and how these changes will affect them. So it'll be interesting to see what these different groups of people think of the changes and what their sort of feedback are. Okay, so that's kind of the changes explained, but let's have a look at them in action. So within the blog post here, the devs have included a picture to show how this looks like a Scrat horde, or maybe a Scrat swarm, depending on how many are there. But the idea is it's showing that you can't spawn these units directly on the bridge. So that's the impact of one of these changes. But let's have a look at these in a little bit more detail. So here's a couple of examples that I set up. On the left, we have the examples running in the current version of the game. That's version 1.44, normal bridge mechanics. And on the right, we have the updated rule set. So these are running in version 1.45. So there's a couple of examples I want to show here. So firstly, collision. So we've got the living statue that's moving over the bridge. And then as you can see, what I'm able to do is place the assassin appropriately timed and placed so that because the assassin is much lighter than the living statue, the assassin gets pushed away from the living statue, which puts it onto the bridge. And therefore you've seen I'm able to grab that bridge without really grabbing the bridge. And if we look at the way that works on the right hand side in version 1.45, you'll see again the statue moves over the bridge and I'm able to place the assassin on the bridge. But if you notice this time, although the assassin is pushed, it's not pushed in quite the same way because the game will not allow it to get on the bridge. And this has shown that I'm not able to take the bridge in the same way. And as we said before, trying to backcap a bridge behind an aggro attack, that's going to be far more difficult. And again, we have another example here. So this is the change for no longer able to place units directly on the bridge. In the current version of the game, you can see the Marines have walked over the bridge is red, and then I'm able to place the Swarmers directly on the bridge, take the bridge, even though they're going to run backwards and defend. And again, if we look at the offshoot of that in the new version, with the new changes, you can see that again, the Marines taken the bridge. I'm not able to place the Swarmers. You can see that the game restricts where they can spawn. And therefore I cannot take the bridge behind, and I will have to clear the bridge, clear the units, clear the aggro before I can take the bridge. So that's a couple of examples of how these changes actually are. Hopefully if you're a visual learner, that's an easier way to see specifically how these changes will affect gameplay. So let's just briefly cover the devs' kind of explanation as to what and why this is going to be. So as mentioned, this is going to be a trial basis for 1.45. After letting people play with these changes for a couple of weeks, we'll put out a survey, say the devs, asking everyone whether they feel the changes were an improvement. The result of this survey will then determine whether we keep the changes or not on a permanent basis. So that'll be interesting to see. I don't know if what they're saying here is the result of the survey will on its own determine that, or if the result of the survey will be one of the forms of feedback that I will take into account. They go forward just to explain the reason for these changes. So they're meant to address the back capping strategy where an opponent captures the bridge. You wait until his minion steps off the bridge and then you immediately place something behind that unit to recapture the bridge. We feel that the prevalence of this strategy is unhealthy for the game for a couple of reasons. And those reasons they explain are being able to use cheap minions in this way makes them comparably more efficient. And as a result, over time, most of the cheaper cards have become somewhat undertuned. This is a big reason why we no longer have 1 mana minion cards. Also, in the hands of skilled players, this strategy can be so effective that it's reshaped the entire meta to revolve around getting to Mana Frenzy first. Not exclusively so, but to a large point. And also that strategy being so effective places an unfortunately large emphasis on exploiting the collision system. Now, I don't really like the phrase exploiting the collision system. I feel like it's a mechanic that people have learned to use. It doesn't feel like an exploit. It's an advanced mechanic. It's something, if people are new to the game and they want to take their gameplay to the next level, these are the sort of things that they can learn about and utilize. So I'm not fully liking the word exploit in there, but that language suggests that this was never a mechanic expected to be part of the game. This is kind of, oh, we need to have a mechanic as to what happens if people play units on top of each other. So we'll have this collision system, but then players learn, oh, actually, this collision system, we can use that to our advantage with regards to taking bridges. So here they continue. In some cases, the main distinction between a skilled player and an unskilled one could be arguably argued to be their ability to understand and effectively utilize this strategy. Again, I kind of disagree, but also agree. I think it is fair to say that a skilled player can be partially differentiated from an unskilled player because they know about this mechanic. They understand this mechanic and they can utilize this mechanic. But that's only one thing that differentiates people of different skill levels. This system is a very niche mechanical aspect of the game and isn't something that it's easily engaged with, except through experience. And outside of getting your small units pushed onto the bridge to capture it, you rarely ever even have to understand how the system works. I mean, I agree with that. The collision of units is fairly irrelevant apart from very niche circumstances. So firstly, you've got the bridge change, but also understanding the way that collision works can help you defend your units because you are able to push units off of a target, re-aggro things by understanding how this collision works and using it to your benefit. So collision will still be part of the game, but it won't be part of the bridge control setup. Now, one thing we do need to, of course, remember is when it comes to the strength of relative cards and their balance, one thing that has to be considered is their effectiveness with regards to taking bridges. So that's why cheap cards, although, you know, for example, let's have a look at crossbow dudes. Crossbow dudes have been nerfed and nerfed and nerfed, but still they're a very, very heavily played card. And the reason is because of their bridge grab ability. For 2 mana, they can take both bridges. You know, they are a ranged unit, which is also a bit of a premium. So these things have to be taken into account. When these changes are put into place and units can no longer take bridges in the way that they used to be able to, what we're going to see is an overall nerf to kind of cheap cards because one of their abilities, their ease of bridge grab, is being removed or reduced. But also it's a buff to the bigger cards because it's kind of glossing over one of their weaknesses. One of their weaknesses was grabbing bridges. Now, if that's no longer such a big thing, it's going to be overall a stronger card. And because bridges are harder to take, those big units that can get on the bridge, but not only get on the bridge, but can stay around for quite a while, that just gives them extra value because it's much harder to take the bridge away from them. So really my point is there's going to have to be some balance changes. So you can't just change this bridge mechanic without having to rebalance some or a lot of the cards. So for example, we're going to see changes to cheaper cards. For example, let's say a scrap pack. So a scrap pack, they're going to increase the number of scratch you get, okay? So their bridge grabbing ability is reduced, but you get some more value. And then the offshoot of that is something like a blue golem. It's because it's going to be technically stronger, it's going to get a reduction in its DPS through its attack speed. Just a couple of examples there. One thing to also bear in mind is there's a few cards that have a mechanic that allow you to take bridges as part of their design. For example, we've got the Stint, which has the tech-fueled bridge grab, the Wrecked Walker that won't aggro on units, Bridge Buddy, Screaming Scrap, Walking Blind Date, Windwalker, She-Howl, etc., etc. So again, when we talk about the balance, these cards are going to be stronger. Bridges are harder to take. If these cards have abilities that make bridges easier to take, then technically they become stronger. So they may be nerfed. For example, Stint's going to get a DPS nerf, I think, for an example. So, and the devs confirm this here. We're adding a slew of balance changes, namely buffing a few low-cost minion cards and nerfing a lot of high-cost minion cards. We're excited about this change, and we're looking forward to seeing how this will affect the meta, and also hearing what you think about it after a couple of weeks after the patch is released on March the 9th. Okay, so put that date in your diary, March the 9th. That's a week after the patches are normally released. They're normally released on the first Thursday of the month. This is going to be the second Thursday of March. Now, this blog post does go on to detail or tease a couple of new cards coming up in the next expansion, and also go through some granular changes of proposed balance changes. But I don't want to cover that in this video. Maybe we'll do that in another video, but I wanted to specify about the bridge changes and what and why those are going to be. And there we have it, a BetaDwarf blog post reaction. So I'll be very interested to hear in the comments what you guys think about these proposed changes to the bridge mechanics. Now, this feels like it's going to be something that we're going to be able to think about for a little while, because we have, which is different to normally, received these patch notes way ahead of time. They aren't necessarily the final patch notes, but they'll give us a very good idea of where the game is heading. So we're going to be able to think about how these changes are going to be played, think about how maybe we will change our decks and our play styles to deal with them. And then, of course, once that happens, when we get to the 9th of March, we'll actually be able to get our hands on it. And that's when we'll be able to see if the things we thought were going to happen are going to happen. Is it going to be good? Is it going to be as good as we thought? Is it going to be as bad as we thought? Is it not really much of an issue? That's when we'll start being able to find out from the testing. And of course, what happens with a lot of these changes is once they come out of the test realm and a lot of people get to try things, that's when certain things, certain techniques, certain deck building styles, they start to really come out. And a lot of them may be things that people hadn't really thought about before, hadn't really tried before. So that's really interesting. And so I think that's where it becomes really healthy to have like a proper season test, everyone get on board, see how it is, see how new players, medium experienced players, experienced veterans, etc., see how they feel about it. So there's a lot of changes, but it'd be interesting to see how they drop. Okay, so I'm excited to see it. Just to confirm, hey, Fishy, how do you feel about the changes? I'm not sure. I do worry that it's dumbing the game down. I do feel like the collision is a skilled part of the game, so I disagree with the fact that that's kind of been seen as an exploit. I don't really like that. And I always wonder with things, as we've seen before, with changes, where you feel like the game is getting dumbed down, you think, hold on, is this kind of a strategy because the devs are thinking about what the game would be like on mobile? And things like playing the collision units, that could be more difficult to play on mobile. So is that something that's within their mindset? I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking what I'm thinking. So I'm not sure. I am worried, of course, concerned that the decks, the aggro decks, are going to get even stronger. Some of them are just so disgusting to play against, and this could make it more difficult. So let's see. I'm sure what will happen if there's some really like OP strategies that come out, then I'm sure the devs will be prepared to hotfix nerfs, etc., if necessary. So that's interesting. I'm excited to see what the changes are, and then we'll, as a community, let's have a discussion and see what we think about it, and then hopefully we can interact with the developer and see what we're going to go, what if the changes are going to stay, if they're going to go, if they're going to be changed in any way. So let's see how that works out. Anyway, just a quick overview of this blog post. Again, the link is in the description if you want to check it out. And of course, let me know what you think in the comments. Anyway, I'm BadAsFish80, and this is an Awkward Wave. And of course, don't forget, if you're enjoying the content here in the fish tank, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe.